Okay, let's get started. I'm also a believer in spending no time on introductions insofar as we have very little time. So I want to get straight into the substance of the panel. And I'm going to start, Andrew, with you and ask you to sort of assess where we are, sort of diagnose where you think we are, and then maybe give some thoughts about where you think we need to go. And then I'm going to ask each one of the other panelists to comment on your comments. Then we'll get into questions.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. A great honor to have shared with this fantastic panel. I want to thank Taijin for inviting me. The theme is about financial stability, but actually it really is about the new order. And we know that the old order is fading away and the new order is emerging, but we don't know what it is. Let's put it this way. So let me try and explain very simply what the old financial order was all about. The world GDP is very easy to understand. It's 100 trillion US dollars. And today, the global financial assets, McKinsey has just published it, it's $486 trillion, which is nearly 5 times. Financial assets divided by GDP is 5 times. In 1980, it was only 1 time. What does that tell you? It tells you that the financial assets are growing faster than real GDP. The real sector hasn't increased that much, but the financial just keeps on printing. Now, why is it printing? We see this very clearly in the former colonies of Britain. The imperial financing model was that if you have a surplus economy, the other European powers, they just went in, they just took everything. The British were very smart. We come in, we issue you a consolidated gilt bond yielding 2% on average. All your surplus savings go to London. I take that money, I invest back in you, in your mines, in your plantations, in your trading houses, and I get an ROE of 20% plus. So the arbitrage model of the colonial model was invented by the British and inherited by the Americans. So Wall Street, after 1945, basically became the premier, center. And but then comes the Triffin dilemma. American dollar printed to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is growing faster than the US, is great. But America can run a current account deficit, a fiscal deficit, and then print more dollars than is necessary in America. And so the American debt keeps on increasing. So by 2021, you have a very strange situation. The money is going uphill. The poor, it was previously, up to 1970, the model was rich countries lend to poor countries. Today, it is the poor countries that are lending to the rich countries. The United States owes the rest of the world on net international investment position of roughly $18 trillion and growing. And if the dollar becomes stronger, the liability becomes more for the US. It makes wonderful sense for US to have a consumer, but most of that liability is debt, not equity. So now, in a very simple risk management perspective, if the world going forward has higher risk, should you finance this through debt or should you finance through equity? And the answer is, the world is going through even more debt underwritten by central banks. So we talk about free markets. How can the world be free markets when the central bank balance sheet, which used to be 2% of world financial assets around before 2008, is today 9% and still growing? Essentially, global central banks are underwriting the whole financial system. Every time the stock market dips, central banks are back in, either lower interest rates or expand balance sheet. This is unsustainable. Now, where does this link with climate change? The climate change issue is very straightforward. we are spending real assets faster than the earth can provide. Why is that? Because of excess borrowing. The more you can print money, the more you can spend. The more you spend, the more you accelerate climate warming. So the whole issue is underwritten by a global financing model that is unsustainable. And that's exactly where we are at this stage. So I hope I've set it up in a relatively simple manner.
Would make one more comment. Talk about everything you just said, the implications for this part of the world.
Well, this part of the world, if you really look at that $18 trillion net liability of the US, 75% of that surplus is basically from Tokyo down to Singapore. So Asia is a net saver, and the reason why Asian savings, as Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee-keat has said, has not been recirculated back within the young part of Asia. North Asia is aging, Southeast Asia is young and has huge natural resources, and a shortage of long-term funds to build the infrastructure, deal with climate change, and solve all the social inequalities. So the challenge going forward is how do Asia use its surplus savings to invest back in Asia? And that would include South Asia, Central Asia, and even West Asia.
Okay, I've got to ask you one more question because this is too interesting. So you've laid out very clearly your diagnosis and very clearly what needs to happen in Asia. My final question is, how does it happen? How does Asia assert itself in such a way as to start to change the behaviors and maybe even the rules?
The issue really is, John, you've worked for Goldman Sachs, you would know this. Goldman's came in the 90s and the 2000s and did this intermediation very, very well. But today, if there is this geopolitical de-risking, who is going to undertake that intermediation role? And that's the $64 trillion question, if I may say so.
Okay, thank you very much. Now what I'd like to do is just go down the line here and have each one of you comment on what Andrew just said and see if you have any particular additions or subtractions or anything else.
So thank you, moderator and Andrew and the distinguished guest. I'm sorry because yesterday I was told by the Vice President of the Caixin, Li Xin, saying they are much encouraged the speakers can speak in Chinese. So since the time is quite limited, so I'm going to share my point of view about this issue in Chinese instead. Okay. 这个我非常认同这个 Angel 的看法。事实上，这是一个我觉得我们这些亚洲国家必须要深刻思考的一个问题。我们亚洲很多的国家的这个民众都非常非常的认真的工作，然后呢，可是这些认真工作的成果，我们并没有很多享受在自己身上，而是把它转换成一个债券，去买了这些只是一些很简单的一些债券。 甚至刚才 Angel 提到，你甚至不是拿的是股票，不是 equity， 不是那个 25% reward， 而是一个2 or 4% 的这些 debt interest rate。事实上，我觉得我们更可以感受最深的就是，你可以看到过去1985年代的时候，日本跟美国这么大的 trade surplus 的时候。 美国不但是印钞票的问题，它是马上宣布我美元贬值，而且要你们来配合我美元贬值，来减轻它的债务负担。同样的，我们亚洲这4个小龙 for dragons 也是一样，在这个后期1980年代后期也是一样，我们有跟美国有非常大的这 huge trade surplus 的时候，也是要求我们这些亚洲4小龙，你们货币要升值，我们要贬值。 所以你可以看到，就是这一套的游戏规则做下来，其实我觉得或许我们这些亚洲国家应该更觉醒。你们这么勤奋、这么努力，创造的一些财富，可是我们常常去买了这些债券的时候呢，它常常就是在必要的时候它就贬值，就减损你的资产价值。所以我是非常赞成这个 Angel 刚才提的，就是这些亚洲国家必须要思考一下，我们有这么多的储蓄的时候。 怎么样把它用在这个亚洲自己的国家，甚至自己的国家里头。而且我们要的不是持有 debt， 而是持有是 equity， 它是一个长期的一个投资。就好像我们看荷兰，我觉得荷兰是一个非常 typical 的 case， 就是当它富了之后呢，你可以看到它的企业是到很多的国家去拿 equity 去做投资，比如说 TSMC， 台湾最大的半导体公司台积电，它一开始除了是台湾政府之外呢，它一直是一个最大的 TSMC 的股东。所以你可以看到，而且它不但只是它出的钱其实很少，它出的是它的专利，它用它的专利帮台积电在起步的时候避开了很多法律障碍，所以它帮助台积电成长。所以在这种情况，可是它得到非常非常多的报酬，因为台积电的股票的价格从那个时候到现在，他们估算是涨了300倍，300倍的 return。所以我觉得这一点，我刚刚非常认同 Angel， 就是说，这些亚洲国家，当你那么勤奋的去做了这么多的努力，产生这么多成果的时候，我觉得应该想办法好好的投资自己，而且找寻一些比较高的报酬，好来得到这些的一个状况。那等一下 Angel 还会再讲，就是说，尤其现在这个区域政治是非常的不稳定。当区域政治不稳定的时候，你持有的这些 debt， 它的价值呢，很可能基于不同的政治原因，它会消失掉。好，像假设啊，比如说你可以看很典型 typical 的就是现在的这个 Russia 这个 invade Ukraine 这个乌克兰，它就造成 Russia 它本身持有的这些债券的价值很大的一个贬损啊。那同样，尤其台海两岸，尤其以我们台湾来讲，这么不稳定的状态之下，持有 debt 持有这么多的美国的资产，是不是一个好的投资？我觉得这也是我们以台湾的立场必须好好思考的问题。这是我简单先对 Angel 的 comment。
Andrew，我觉得在此前跟沈先生就这个问题有过很多次的这个交流，他的挑战和反思每一次呢都让我们很受启发。的确，在半年前东盟的一个会议上，很多国家的领导人也都在思考这一个问题。就是在以美元为中心的国际货币体系之下，如何来保障每一个国家自己的主权货币和自己的主权储备的安全。那么对于中国呢，也在大力的推动人民币的国际化，从而能够使得我们的以人民币为中心的货币的体制在国际规则允许之下，在世界经济当中能够获得越来越多的认同。我想呢，这是一个非常意义深远的工作，也是一个很有挑战的工作。但我想，这个世界的贸易体系、货币体系和汇率体系，终究应该沿着一个多边的方向、平等的方向、平等互利的方向来往前发展。这是我的一点个人看法。
我也感谢蔡欣的邀请。To keep the balance, I will use English. So, John, I would like to think that it is the 4 Ds. You know, Andrew, you talked about deglobalization and de-risking. I would like to add 2 Ds, and one of them is a diversification for a D, and one of them is digitalization for a D. With a bifurcated world, there is clear trends to diversify many different areas. The first is obviously trade. The second is supply chain. The third is currencies, right? The rise of Bitcoin, I don't think is coincidental. Despite, you know, pressures on Binance and Coinbase, you know, you see the sort of steadiness of BTC as fairly instructive. I think there is a diversification of financial hubs. Andrew, you talked about the dominance of New York and a lot of the Western world now kind of really focused on US dollar, US treasuries and the NASDAQ or the S&P. I would like to think that going forward, the world will be looking at diversification of financial hubs, right? Diversification of time zones, diversification of currencies, diversification of trade lines, manufacturing chains, etc. And with the digitalization that we are seeing, the fact is real-time changes and real-time payments and real-time everything means the world is very reactive. We are in a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, complex world. And therefore, I'm a pragmatist. I mean, we're here to discuss how do we survive in this VUCA world. We can talk about geopolitics till the cows come home, but we really need to solve short-term and medium-term issues. And so I think using digital solutions helps. The ability to use data and digitalization to give you real-time information. Right? The fact that Silicon Valley Bank went down because somebody tweeted, that, oops, there's a problem with their mark-to-markets on their hold to maturity or hold to collect portfolio, means that in order to survive, we have to not just diversify, we've got to use digital solutions and data to stay ahead of trends, to control your own narrative, right? Using digital solutions means you can now effect real-time payments. You can effect diversified chains. You've now got blockchain to enable cross-border payments that doesn't necessarily have to go through SWIFT. You have multi-currency solutions, SIPs to Levin's point, and internationalization of the RMB could also be a future long-term trend. So I am hopeful. I don't want to be too dystopic. I am hopeful, but I do think that life is getting a lot tougher, faster, and we have to react.
So I want to ask you a question. I remember very distinctly being in Beijing in 2008 for the Olympics. And the world was sort of slightly unraveling. There had already been the acquisition of Bear Stearns by JP Morgan. And I was invited to a sort of an internal Chinese meeting on the question of where is the world going and what should we be thinking about? And in preparation for that meeting, I spoke to a number of U.S. senior officials, some U.S. Industrial company CEOs, and some of the best U.S. investors, and asked them their view. And lo and behold, the U.S. government officials were the most optimistic of the three. The most pessimistic were the investors. Okay, so now, and I remember at the time, essentially what happened was the U.S. system underestimated the severity of what was happening. And then Lehman Brothers happened, and then we all know what happened. Okay, so here we are sitting many years later, and the title of this thing is what lessons have we learned, or can we learn? And so my question for you is this. Is what's going on right now in the U.S., Silicon Valley Bank going under, First Republic getting bought, all that, are the financial institutions here saying to themselves, wait a minute, we got to look at this more carefully than maybe we otherwise might have. We've really got to get on top of these things so that we're in as robust shape as we can be. Because in my experience, when there's radical change, people tend to underestimate the speed at which things can happen. And so that even though they sort of start getting their mind around it, they don't actually take action. And so what I'm asking is, I'm just asking a question of fact, which is, are the better financial institutions in Asia at the moment doing what they need to do?
So, John, we're staying paranoid.
Good.
We have to stay paranoid. We have to ring fence our risk. We'll have buckets of risk. The US dollar remains the dominant currency of choice. We all trade in the US dollars. We all have holdings in treasuries. But diversify. You don't have to have everything in Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae and mortgage-backed securities that are 30 years. You can diversify. And the fact is, the Asian demographic story in South and Southeast Asia is good. there is a rising trend of digitalization, leapfrogging of technology. There's adoption of AI. So it's being nimble and being able to react quickly and also bucketing your risk so that you don't have too much contagion in your portfolio.
Levin, would you like to comment on the stability of the Chinese financial system?
Levin. 问你.
Did you hear my question? My question was, would you like to give some comments on the Chinese financial system and its stability at the moment?
Yeah, you mean the economic recovery, right? I just want to say something about this.
Please.
Yeah, can I do this?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. As we discussed before the meeting, yeah, indeed, China have a very different economic cycle, I think, than the US states and the United States and Europe do. In the past years, the West has entered a cycle of low growth, high inflation, and rapid interest rate hikes. China, on the other hand, is in a cycle of growth recovery, low inflation, and interest rate cuts. In theory, China's strong recovery should be quite certain, but the recent data is not as good as the expected, I think. Therefore, the capital market also reacted poorly due to the weak recovery of China's post-pandemic now. But I believe there are two main factors behind this, I think. Firstly, some previous policy adjustments, just like those in the real estate market, and are still a drag on the economy to some degree. However, I think these policies shows that China has been proactively deleveraging from the risk prevention perspective. They might be painful in the short term, but they are beneficial for the long-term development, I think. Secondly, compared to the West, China's stimulus policies are not as aggressive. China's monetary easing has been relatively moderate. So because of these two factors, it is reasonable that China's economic recovery needs more time, I think. But in fact, I have high confidence in China's economic recovery. We expect China's GDP growth rate to rise from 2.9% to 6% in 2023. We believe that when the US and Europe are facing possible recessions and the external demand remains weak, domestic demand is key to drive the recovery. Firstly, from the consumption side, households have accumulated around 3 trillion RMB of excess savings during the pandemic, accounting for about 2.5% of China's GDP in 2022. As consumers' confidence gradually improves, I think it will support consumption recovery. Secondly, from the investment side, China has recently been cutting interest rate, leading to continued decline in financing costs. As corporate confidence improves, investment in sectors like infrastructure are likely to rebound. This could further drive employment and consumption growth. Meanwhile, the real estate market bubble is well contained at the moment. I think more policy support to stabilize the economy is on the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee, do you want to make any comments on the learnings of the central banks here from what's gone on in the United States? Do you want to make any comments about what has been learned by the central banks in Asia from the actions taken by the U.S. central bank recently.
Thank you for the question about the lesson from the recently about the turmoil in the United States and the European countries. OK，我想这一块我们倒是可以得到很多的一个想法哈，因为这一次在这个美国跟欧洲在处理 SVB 或者是 Credit Suisse， 我们看到都有一个共同的现象，就是他们在这些金融机构它的 net worth 还是正的时候，还没有变负的时候，他就非常大胆的进去做 take over， 而且呢就开始做这个 merge 的这个动作啊。那我觉得是说，从这个一般来讲会觉得说，哎，会不会觉得动作太快，对这个银行的 bank owner 是不是不太公平啊？可是我是觉得说，因为现在的经济状态不太一样，因为现在不管是美国或是欧洲，都在处理就是对抗通货膨胀的同时呢，希望避免经济衰退。这本来就是一个很难处理的一个问题，就是怎么样避免经济衰退，又要对抗通货膨胀。所以也就是说，经济处在一个非常不稳定的状态，尤其还有很多的外在影响因素，俄乌战争啦、climate change 啦这些等等外在的因素在干扰。所以这个时候呢，稳定金融体系变得非常非常的重要。所以我是觉得刚才这个 Larry Summers 也特别提到，就是说，虽然美国现在这个发生问题都是 small and medium size 的这个银行，可是这个时候 regain 的 confidence 是非常非常重要，就是你要对银行有信心，对金融体系让它有信心之后，让它稳定下来，政府才能够很专心的去处理这个整个实质经济面的这个很大的挑战。其实，在欧洲也是一样，就是 Credit Suisse 呢，它本身因为长期的一些问题哦，所以民众对它的 corporate governance 或者对它的 legal compliance 已经失掉信心了。再加上它的新的这个沙烏地阿拉伯的这个国家银行的 major shareholder 已经 announce 说它不再增资，所以这个时候人们对它的信心已经丧失的时候，你必须要非常快的去处理。因为我一直在讲说，银行产业它是跟一般的产业不太一样，它是一个非常强调信心的产业，因为它是高度的 leverage 的产业，而且它透过这个借贷的关系，它是 leverage 这个杠杆倍数是非常高，再加上它的资产负债，它的 duration 是不 match 的，它是借短的，就是它是用短期的这个负债去支持长期的资产，所以它 duration 也是 mismatch 的，所以它的信心上，就是对民众的这个信心的维持是非常非常重要。所以再加上大的总体经济环境不稳定，这个时候如果你的金融环境面再去碰到有一些信心的危机的话，会加重你处理实质经济面的问题。我记得常常人家比喻这个金融体系，就是说，如果当你的实质经济面，就是 real economics 这个 sector 出问题的时候，万一你的金融体系再不稳定的话，它就像一个扬声器。它会把你的实质经济面的不好的状况加倍的扩大。反过来，如果实质经济面是好的，可是你的金融体系自己不稳定的时候，它是一个搅拌器，它会把你所有的经济面都搅得非常乱。所以2008年是一个非常 typical case， 就是实质经济面本来是没事情的，可是你金融体系出了问题，所以它可以把你实质经济面搅得很差。可是反过来讲，如果你的 real sector 出问题的时候，你这个时候经济再不稳定，它会变得更糟糕。我在这边呢是想要分享一下这个2008年我们台湾发生的一个 case 啊，在2008年的时候，其实当美国发生就欧美发生 financial crisis 的时候，其实台湾的银行业并没有持有太多的这些不好的资产，所以我们在银行的 assets and liability 我们没有太多受伤。我们碰到的问题是，台湾是一个非常典型的出口导向的经济，所以我们出口变得非常非常的重要。所以当欧美经济不好的时候，我们经济马上受到很大的冲击。第二个，它是中小企业为主，所以只要一有风吹草动，你的经济不好的时候，你金融体系稍微有一点断裂，不供应资金，它马上中小企业就倒了。而中小企业呢，虽然产值不是那么大，可是它对就业帮助很大。台湾的中小体系的中小企业，它的产值占我们在看 GDP 30%，可是它的就业贡献了70%。所以在这种情况之下，台湾碰到的状态是，因为欧美发生 financial crisis， 所以我们的出口受到很大的冲击，我们的就业受到很大的冲击，中小企业倒闭。 其实我们金融体系刚刚讲本身没有太大的问题，可是这个时候因为对金融体系信心丧失，所以这个时候呢，银行存款大量从我们的民间银行里头流出去，所以大量的银行存款流失。那因为银行存款流失，造成民众对金融体系更没有信心，而且金融体系也为了保有资金，开始紧缩银根，开始对这小企业呢，开始就不太提供它的这个资金。所以你可以看到，我们那时候的台湾的经济体系，甚至受伤的比欧美国家都重。我们的 GDP 在我们2008年第4季是 -10%， 所以重的比欧美国家受伤都还重。所以这个时候，因为那个时候我刚好是 financial regulator。所以我们就很快的给了政府一个建议，就是说，你碰到这么多的失业，这么多的工厂倒闭，这么多的罢工，金融体系有这个流失，我们给他一个政策建议，就是100% deposit guarantee， 就是希望我们政府你赶快宣布存款保险，把金融体系稳定下来，它的存款不再流失。可是我们同时也要求了另外2个条件，你今天的银行对于企业，如果他 promise 答应说，我这个 lay off 的员工不会超过1% 的，这些企业你要无条件的正常的支持他，因为我政府支持你，给你100% deposit guarantee， 你就要遵守义务，对于承诺你不会裁员1%的大于1% 的公司，你必须 regular 提供他的资金，在我给你100%存款保证的期间。所以这个时候你可以看到，我们台湾的经济体系很快就稳定下来。当我们这个政策一宣布出去之后，因为银行体系马上信心恢复了，所以它就没有在很多的存款流失，它就继续贷款给我们这些中小企业。然后中小企业因为它有 promise， 它不会大量裁员，所以这个员工在那个公司都还维持着。所以你可以看到，当全球经济一恢复的时候，因为我们的工厂都还在，我们的员工都还在，所以很快全球经济一恢复，我们马上就跟上去了。所以2009年的时候，全世界预估台湾的经济成长率应该是 -4%， 可是我们事实上只有 -1.8%。然后第2年2010年，我们经济成长是10.多个 percent，over 10%。所以我要讲的就是说，当你的 real side 的这个 economy 不是很稳定的时候，你金融体系的稳定是非常非常重要。所以刚才 Larry Summers 讲说，处理这些金融机构没有这个完美的处理方式，所以我可以理解，就是说美国跟 Swiss 这个政府，它为什么会在一个这几家银行净值还是正的情况之下，他就这么大胆的做这些的决策？因为他碰到的总体经济的实质面是一个非常不确定，而且是碰到一个通货膨胀跟萧条已经很棘手在处理的问题，所以我是觉得说我是可以理解，尤其是从我们过去处理这一块经验里头得到的一些经验。
Well, I think it's great discussion. I think Shushan put her finger on this. We're all paranoid now. And why are we all paranoid? Because everything is connected to everything else. I think, John, you made the point. In 2008, we had the Olympics, right? We had Lehman Brothers. And people completely forgot. I was completely outside my radar screen. We had Georgia. And, anybody who was focusing in that area would know that Georgia then led to Minsk, then led to Crimea, and led to Ukraine. And by the way, SVB and Credit Suisse is completely related to what happened in Ukraine. Let's be realistic about it. That war created the inflation that caused the interest rates to go up, that created the asset mismatch for SVB, and then the withdrawal of deposits from Credit Suisse, right? It's all related. So we're in a very complex world in which we are wearing 19th century glasses looking at 21st century problems. And we don't know how to deal with this, right? We don't know how to deal with this. We are blind to our own blindness, as Kahneman says. So what we're now seeing is that the global balance sheet is out of whack. And the only thing that is holding the global balance sheet together is expecting the Fed to print more money. Because if the Fed is going to raise more interest rates, that balance sheet is going to shrink. And if it's going to print more money, the problem is postponed, and we haven't dealt with the structural issues. okay, which has basically not just global security implications, but the huge problem of global insecurity. And the key question that I want to pose to everybody is continuance of printing debt a solution to a resilient world or a more fragile world? The answer for any finance guy is very obvious.
Levin, do you want to make some comments about the Chinese financial system and the extent to which we can expect more opening up in the current climate?
Sorry, John, who are you pointing to?
Asking Levin.
Levin.
Asking Levin.
Yeah.
这样谢谢您这个问题啊，这个虽然在之前的这个可能应该是您回答的一个问题，但是我先讲一讲，我先讲一讲，我觉得中国从来没有停止过开放的步伐，所以应该来说这一个问题的前提，我觉得可能就有一些误解，只不过在不同的中国的经济的发展的阶段。可能我们开放的强调的内容会有所不同。比如说，在2015年，在疫情之前2017年的时候，那么中国在那个时候更加强调的是资本市场的深化改革开放，也就是说进一步的引入、降低我们在资本市场上的这个准入的门槛。从而呢，能够吸引更多的国际投资人能够进入到中国的这个市场来进行投资。当然，疫情3年对全世界的经济秩序都造成了巨大的影响，中国也会受到一定的影响。但是，其实中国改革开放的步伐从来没有停止。那么，我想现在中国面临的目前疫情后同全世界一样，如何能够进入到一个正常的经济发展秩序、高速的发展经济，对于中国和其他国家的政府是一样，都是一个重要的课题。那我想在这个过程当中，深化改革开放仍然是一个主旋律。那我就先说这么些，因为这个本来是您的问题。
没有，他刚才是问你的 ，Levin。我觉得中国市场最需要的是信心。So, John, I said that, what the Chinese market needs now is confidence. And from an outside perspective, being out here in Singapore, the Chinese economy has a lot going for it. But I guess what we want to see is more stability, more transparency, and just more clarity, right? Whilst the US has raised rates from 25 bips to 5.25 bips, that's 21x. The Chinese have cut rates. They've cut their loan prime rate. They've, had a more constructive monetary policy. The new leaders have categorically said that the economic recovery is a key impetus for them. It's a key focus. Well, the ducks are aligned. We need to see the economic wheels, step up in motion. We need to see confidence. We need to see investments, and that will come when people feel like, okay, this train is leaving. The market will turn. We can invest. We can make money. Entrepreneurs can safely reinvest in the markets and do well. I think that confidence and notion needs to be clear and needs to be stable. So I do think that from an outside perspective, we want to see that. With the opening up of China, the manufacturing cost of North Asia still is the best in class, right? Be it in EVs or upstream battery manufacturing. Even the Goldman Sachs report on the little giants. The little giants are basically the SMEs of China, particularly in South China and GBA, which is in high-end manufacturing, tech manufacturing. there are a lot of good stuff bubbling up down there, and that just needs to be encouraged and blossomed. Now, when we have bifurcated financial lines and investments, when you have Sequoia creating their own in-country RMB fund, and everyone else looking in thinking, shall I go in, shall I not? We've got this wait-and-see attitude right now, which I believe we can fast-track when there's confidence and stability.
Okay, so you've raised a very, very good, important point, and I want to finish on this because we only have a few minutes left. And if you want to add anything, please add. But let's imagine this. Let's imagine that at the end of June, the economic numbers in China are weaker than we think, and even weaker than those of us who think they're weaker. And at that point, the world is going to look at that number and get very nervous. And all those things you're talking about are going to get worse. So if you were giving advice to the Chinese economic leadership, what would your advice be as to what they should do if that turns out to be the reality? And I'm sorry, I'm going to go right down the line here with each one of you.
Well, I'm certainly not one to. The Chinese government is very smart, and they certainly have a lot of data at hand to be instructive as to what kind of policies they need to effect. But I do believe that they see the data points on unemployment, youth unemployment specifically. They see the data points on consumption. There was a post, opening up, small V shape that's kind of sputtered a little bit. And the export numbers have been rather, slow. And I think there needs to be, how do you get animal spirits back in, right? How do you encourage more domestic investments and more economic activity? Is you need to create velocity of money. You need, so they're already reducing the cost of money, and increasing the velocity of money means you need to encourage commerce, and they're starting to do that. The opening up to encourage people to buy local, go out and eat and spend money, and they need to find ways to create jobs. I do think that youth unemployment, especially for white-collar workers, in a day of AI, ironically, it's going to be tough. So finding new ways of employing these smart young graduates in China, and encouraging SMEs, which is what they are doing, but really putting investments behind these SMEs, and also allowing the big companies to thrive in this part of the world, thrive in Asia, do a lot more of this upstream domestic investments. You're seeing it in Indonesia. Indonesia and China, you're seeing it. You're seeing it China and Saudi. So encouraging this upstream manufacturing in battery and in precursors, in low-end manufacturing in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. I think creating that whole supply chain and encouraging young Chinese business people to come out here, which they are. I mean, they're all here in the ballroom. Encouraging this sort of more bilateral business outflows, I think is the way forward.
Okay. Levin, what is your advice to the leadership, the economic leadership of China, as to what they should do if, in fact, the numbers get even weaker?
Uh, 其实在目前就是中国的经济数字比较疲软，或者说经济复苏的数据不如预期的好的情况下呢，政府已经在更加的加大了力度。我想这个应该来，刚才在我前一个的陈述当中我已经讲过，中国的在此前我们的经济刺激政策是不如西方国家那么激进的，或者说我们留有了更多的余地的。那因此呢，在下一阶段呢，应该来说我们无论从中国的中央银行还是其他的经济部门，他们有更多的政策工具，可以进一步的加大对经济刺激和提振的力度。但是我刚才也讲到，中国是一个庞大的经济体，已经是全球第2大 GDP 的国家。这么大的一个经济体，它如同一个巨大的火车， 它的受到疫情影响，它的增长速度慢下来，它的惯性也会大于一个很小的经济体。所以我觉得我们需要更多的耐心，等待这么大的一个经济体，它的提速向前冲的速度，提速的时间是一定要有的，一定不可能像想象那样，迅速在1个月、2个月之内，整个的经济的速度会增长到，像想象那样超过5%。我觉得我们还需要有一点耐心，但是我们更应该有信心，因为可以看得很清楚。那么中国的出口数字尽管比预期的不是那么强劲，但是呢，中国的这个电池储能工业，中国的太阳能相关的这样的一个产业以及呢这个电动汽车的产业，这一些的出口的带动作用是非常强的，对中国经济的这个出口的支撑的，已经越来越成为一个支撑性的力量。所以可以看得出来，中国的经济的升级也在艰难的在往上走，在往前走。所以我觉得我们还是应该充满信心。
Same question?
Same question.
Okay. 我想，因为台湾对中国大陆的经济是最敏感的因为我们40%的出口都是在中国大陆所以如果中国大陆的经济不像我们预期中成长的这么好的话，对台湾的经济的冲击是非常非常大的。而且呢，中国除了是我们出口最大的这个市场之外，也是我们过去至少在2020年之前，是我们最大的投资市场那也是我们最大的 trade surplus 来源。如果台湾跟中国大陆的这个 trade surplus 拿掉的话，我们对全球的 trade 其实上是 deficit 是赤字的。所以中国大陆的经济能不能够照预期的恢复，对台湾的影响是非常非常大。可是我们也发觉到是说，我们不能够像过去这样子一直单独的集中在中国大陆市场。所以我们现在政府是非常鼓励往东南亚国家投资。所以我们看到刚刚讲2020年之后，你可以看到我们台湾的商人投资在这个中国大陆跟投资在东南亚的比例发生很明显的转变。那当这几个转变的原因，除了我刚刚讲风险分散的考量，就是不要太集中在一个市场，不管还有政治上的考量，也不希望太集中在一个市场。还有其他很重要的原因，来自于中美贸易战、中美经济战。那早期我们台商虽然有一些厂商会因为中国的成本增加了，所以跑到东南亚来投资，这是一波。可是新的这一波是因为中美经贸对抗非常的严重，这些台湾的科技厂商被这一些这个 buyer 他们的最后的买主，比如说 Apple 或是 HP 这些厂商要求你要到东南亚去分散投资市场。所以我们可以看到，现在台湾为什么最近这几年在中南亚的投资成长得非常的快，是因为很大部分是来自于厂商的，就是我们最后买主的要求。那第三个呢，是来自于台湾都没有签这个 FTA。在以前呢，因为台湾几乎我们签那个 FTA Free Trade Agreement， 事实上整个在台湾的贸易呢，出口大概不到10%。这是非常不利的一个状态。可是我们跟中国大陆因为签了一个贸易协议，就是叫 RCEP， 我们签了一个贸易协议，所以就变成我们出口到大陆享受了很多关税上有点类似进 FTA 的一些的条件，所以我们就更集中的往那个市场去倾斜。可是现在政府发觉这样不行了，就鼓励我们的厂商，你就干脆到ASEAN 这些国家去投资，避开这个国际上的关税贸易障碍。因为我刚刚讲，因为台湾就是跟主要的这个 major trade partner 都没有签这个 FTA， 所以这是第三点，是政府鼓励。那政府鼓励，所以你可以看到我刚刚讲，就是我们还是非常关切大陆的这个经济成长，对我们台湾的冲击还是很大。可是我们是加快速度在布局东南亚的市场，甚至因为这样子，我们政府呢也鼓励我们的金融机构到东南亚国家去。第一个，他是觉得第一个你要服务你的客户，既然你这么多的客户都到东南亚国家去了，所以你要去服务你的客户。第二个，我们觉得潜在 potentially， 我们发觉事实上东南亚国家我们做过一些评估， 发觉是有商机的。尤其是过去哦，大家都觉得我们台湾的银行拼不过欧美国家的这个竞争力，可是到东南亚国家，我们发觉我们的竞争力还可以，除了新加坡之外。所以我发觉就是说，好像现在你可以看到过去，比如说我举个例子，2020年1月到2022年1月这2年期间，我们台湾的银行申请到海外去设分行，总共有16家，其中13家都在东南亚国家。所以你可以看到，就是说，我们现在除了我刚刚讲的，就是我们还是非常关心、很期待大陆的经济能够很好的正常发展，因为我们也相信这个隔一段时间，诚如刚才2位主持人讲的，可能应该会好好考起来。我们也自己给自己更多的这个保障，分散风险，所以我们做很多的分散风险的投资。
The issues are very straightforward. China's economy's issues are not independent of the world, and the world's economic problems are not independent of China. So Chinese policies affect the world, right? And that's why we're so concerned. Now, any crisis or problems have 3 elements. One is the liquidity problem, one is the stock balance sheet problem, and the third one is the trust issue. The first issue is that liquidity is not a problem because the Chinese got enough reserves, foreign exchange surplus to deal with all the problems. So the real issue is that most people fail to recognize that the 2008 crisis was the beginning of the global balance sheet recession, and that we have stimulated through monetary printing, which did not solve the structural issues. China, as you know, what has happened is China will definitely avoid making the mistake of the 2009, the 4 trillion stimulus, which threw China out of whack. And when it threw China out of whack, it taught a very important lesson. There is no single country that is big enough to solve the global problems. So China this time around will not stimulate in order to solve the global problems and create more problems for its own issues. Now, how you recalibrate that balance sheet depends upon the trust issue. And the trust issue problem is that any monetary policy in China is not independent of global monetary policy, right? And here's the difference between 1998 crisis and 08 crisis. 08, 09, as you made the very good point, we could pick up the phone to Ted Truman, to Tim Geithner, etc., and solve these issues. Who do you pick up the phone now to call? And the answer is, we don't know each other. And how are you going to solve the global problems when you don't have the trust and don't know each other is the big, barrier to global solution of global problems.
Okay, we've run over time, so if you can join me in thanking our outstanding panel, I'd appreciate it. And also one minor thing, which is the 2 watchwords for this panel are patience and paranoia. Thank you.
Thank you all for the thought-provoking discussion.